The spoon is small, barely a centimeter of curved metal, the kind that comes free with a jar of instant coffee. You dip it into a bag of white crystals, tip it into a cup, and don't think about it again. It dissolves before you've finished stirring. Nothing about that gesture feels like history. It feels like nothing at all. A reflex, a habit, background noise in an ordinary morning. But your tongue is doing something that has nothing to do with your morning. The receptors lighting up as that sweetness spreads across your mouth are running a program older than your species, older than primates as we'd recognize them, older than the continent you're probably sitting on. The question of when humans first started eating sugar sounds like it should have a clean answer. A date, a place, a first bite. It doesn't. And the real story is stranger than a first bite, because the craving arrived tens of millions of years before the sugar did. Picture a forest that no longer exists. Northern Egypt, more than 30 million years ago, when the region was thick, wet woodland instead of desert. Somewhere in that canopy, a small primate, nothing you'd call a monkey or an ape in the modern sense, but an ancestor of both, is choosing what to eat. It has options: hard nuts and seeds, tough and durable, protected by shells that take real effort to crack, or soft, ripe fruit, yielding easily, packed with sugars the animal's body can burn almost instantly. This is not a small decision. In a world with no stored food, no agriculture, no guarantee of a meal tomorrow, the difference between a diet built around hard, slow release calories and one built around soft, sugar rich fruit is the difference between two very different survival strategies. Hard foods protect their calories behind labor. Soft, sugary foods hand their calories over cheaply, but only during the season they're ripe, and only if you can find them before something else does. Whichever way that ancient primate leaned would leave a mark. Not in a journal, not in a memory, but in the hardest tissue in its body. Teeth do not lie about what has passed over them for years. They chip when they meet resistance. They decay when they're bathed in sugars long enough for bacteria to feed on the residue. A skeleton can't tell you what an animal wanted, but it can tell you, with unsettling precision, what an animal actually chewed, year after year, for the whole of its life. That's the puzzle a group of researchers set out to solve using fossils from a place in Egypt called the Fayum Depression, one of the richest fossil beds anywhere for understanding how monkeys and apes got their start. And what they found in those ancient teeth would end up saying something not just about extinct primates, but about you reaching for that spoon. The team, led by dental anthropologist Ian Towle, alongside colleagues Matthew Borths and Carolina Lach, examined 421 fossilized teeth belonging to 5 different genera of early anthropoids. The group that includes the ancestors of every monkey and ape alive today, humans included. They were looking for two things: chips, which suggest biting down on something hard, and cavities, which are strongly associated in living primates with a diet of soft, sugar rich fruit. The results were almost lopsided. Only about 5% of the teeth showed any chipping at all, a strikingly low number compared to primates today that regularly crack nuts or seeds. At the same time, the caries patterns pointed toward exactly the profile you'd expect from animals eating soft, ripe fruit on a regular basis. Towle summarized it simply: the evidence hints at a preference for soft food sources like ripe, sugary fruits. That's not a minor detail buried in an old fossil bed. That's a straight line running from an animal that existed 40 to 29 million years ago to the biology sitting inside your mouth right now. Because sweetness detection isn't something that evolved once in humans for no particular reason. It's carried by a gene called TAS1R2, present across the primate family tree, shaped over millions of years by exactly the kind of dietary pressure the Phaeum teeth are describing. Animals that could detect and crave sugar-dense food got a reliable, fast source of energy. Animals that couldn't, didn't. Here's where it gets genuinely counterintuitive. We tend to imagine our ancestors as tough, lean, meat-focused survivors, and sugar as something soft and modern layered on top of that toughness. The fossil evidence says something closer to the reverse. Soft, sugary fruit may have been the foundational diet, the default, energy-efficient choice, long before any hominin ever picked up a spear or lit a fire. The taste for sugar isn't a modern indulgence bolted onto an ancient, disciplined body. It's one of the oldest instincts that body has. None of this means our early primate relatives were living some kind of endless fruit buffet. Fruiting seasons are unpredictable. Trees compete for the same ripe branches. Birds, insects, other primates, all chasing the same narrow window before the sugar content peaks and the fruit falls or rots. An animal with a strong drive toward sweetness had an edge in that competition, provided it could find the fruit fast enough and often enough to matter. That pressure didn't disappear when our own lineage split off millions of years later. It just changed shape. Instead of fruit alone, early hominins in Africa had access to something even more concentrated: honey. And getting it meant confronting one of the more dangerous exchanges in the natural world: a payload of pure, fast-burning sugar guarded by thousands of insects willing to defend it violently. We don't have direct physical evidence of the very first person who ever robbed a wild hive. What we have is much later, but still remarkable: a painting on a cave wall in eastern Spain, in a site now called the Cuevas de la Araña, showing a human figure suspended on what looks like a rope or vine ladder, reaching into a crevice where bees have built a nest. It's widely considered the oldest surviving depiction of humans deliberately gathering honey anywhere in the world. Its exact age is debated. Estimates cluster somewhere between roughly 6 and 10,000 years old, and researchers openly acknowledge that dating this style of rock art is difficult. But the scene itself needs no argument. It shows someone climbing toward danger for something sweet, at a height where a fall would be serious, surrounded by insects capable of stinging repeatedly. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes what eating sugar meant for most of human history. It wasn't a habit. It wasn't a snack. It was a calculated risk, undertaken rarely, for a substance so energy-dense that the danger was considered worth it. Sugar wasn't something you had. It was something you earned at real physical cost, a handful of times a year if you were lucky and skilled. That scarcity is the piece almost entirely missing from how we think about sugar today, and it's the hinge the rest of this story turns on. Because at some point in a part of the world thousands of kilometers from that Spanish cave, people stopped simply searching for sugar and started growing it. The best current evidence points to the highlands of New Guinea, where a wild grass called Saccharum robustum was domesticated into what we now call sugarcane, likely somewhere around 6 to 8,000 years ago. This estimate comes mostly from genetic and linguistic reconstruction rather than a single dramatic archaeological find. The region's wet tropical soil is notoriously unkind to preserved plant remains. But a major 2025 genomic study tracing the ancestry of hundreds of modern cane varieties confirmed New Guinea as the crop's origin point. What's easy to miss is how modest this beginning actually was. Early New Guinean cultivators weren't refining anything. They were growing cane to feed pigs and to chew raw, sucking out the sweet juice and spitting out the fiber. Much as some communities in the region were still doing well into the 20th century, sugar at this stage was still fundamentally a plant you consumed by hand, in its own body, unprocessed. The astonishing part of the story, the part that would eventually reshape economies, empires, and human health on a global scale, hadn't happened yet. That part happened later in India, when someone worked out how to boil cane juice down, cool it, and coax it into solid crystals. The exact timing of this breakthrough is genuinely contested among historians. Some place it as early as the 5th century BCE, others as late as the Gupta period, around the 4th century CE. What isn't contested is what the innovation meant. A liquid that spoiled quickly and traveled poorly had been turned into a solid, storable, tradable commodity. In Sanskrit, this new substance was called sharkara, meaning grit or gravel, the root of the word sugar itself. From India, the knowledge spread outward along trade and diplomatic routes. Sailors carried it toward southern China by around 500 BCE. Centuries later, in the 7th century CE, Chinese envoys traveled specifically to India to learn sugar refining methods after the Tang emperor took a personal interest in the crop. From there, it moved toward Persia, and eventually into the Mediterranean world, arriving in Europe as an exotic, expensive rarity, something closer to a spice or a medicine than a food. For a long stretch of history, that's exactly what sugar remained: rare, costly, and mostly reserved for the wealthy or the sick. And that scarcity had a strange side effect on human bodies, one that shows up not in written records, but in the teeth of the dead. Across multiple bioarchaeological studies, from the Natufian hunter-gatherers of the ancient Levant to Neolithic farming communities in China and Ukraine, researchers have found a consistent, though not universal, pattern. As populations shifted toward intensive farming, especially grain-based farming, rates of dental caries tended to rise. The explanation makes biological sense. Starchy, processed grains break down into fermentable sugars in the mouth, feeding the same bacteria that thrive on sugar itself. But, and this matters, the story isn't as tidy as it's often told. A 2019 reanalysis published in Current Anthropology looked closely at the data behind this narrative and found something more complicated. Caries rates between farming and hunter-gatherer populations actually overlapped by more than 70%. Climate, it turned out, was also a meaningful factor, sometimes rivaling diet in its effect on dental disease. The popular image of pristine, cavity-free hunter-gatherers giving way to decayed-toothed farmers is real in aggregate, but nowhere near as clean or universal as it's usually presented. So even the "farming ruined our teeth" story, one of the most repeated claims in popular nutrition writing, turns out to be an oversimplification. Which raises an obvious question. If farming alone didn't cause the dramatic decline in oral health that we associate with the modern world, what did? The answer comes from an unusually elegant piece of research. In 2013, a team led by geneticist Christina Adler examined calcified dental plaque that hardens into a mineral called calculus and can survive on teeth for thousands of years. From 34 skeletons spanning roughly 7,500 years of European history. What they were really examining was ancient bacterial DNA, a fossilized snapshot of the bacterial communities that once lived in these people's mouths. The results showed exactly what you'd expect at first, a shift toward a less healthy, disease-associated bacterial community when farming began in the early Neolithic. But then something unexpected appeared. Between that early agricultural shift and roughly 400 years ago, the oral microbiome stayed remarkably stable. It was only during the Industrial Revolution that everything changed again, and changed far more sharply. That's when the cavity-causing bacteria, now considered normal in modern mouths, became dominant for the first time. Sit with that for a second. The Agricultural Revolution, 10,000 years in the making, produced a real but comparatively modest shift in human oral bacteria. The Industrial Revolution, barely 2 centuries old, produced a bigger one. Something happened in that short window that outweighed the accumulated dietary change of the entire Neolithic era. What happened was supply. Sugar stopped being something you climbed a cliff for, or imported at great expense from across an ocean, and became something manufactured on an industrial scale. Grown on vast Caribbean plantations using forced and enslaved labor, and shipped to Europe in quantities no earlier century could have imagined. The anthropologist Sidney Mintz documented the scale of the shift with a single, jarring statistic. British per capita sugar consumption rose from roughly 4 pounds a year in 1700 to about 18 pounds a year in 1800, a fourfold increase within a single century, driven by an economic system built on human suffering few of those consumers ever saw. That is the real rupture in this story. Not the moment some ancient primate first tasted a piece of ripe fruit. Not the moment a person in Bronze Age Spain risked a fall to rob a wild hive. Not even the invention of crystallized sugar in ancient India. The rupture is barely 200 years old. The moment an ancient, deeply conserved craving inherited across tens of millions of years of primate evolution was finally handed an unlimited, cheap, year-round supply of exactly what it had always been asking for. Your body was never built for that supply. It was built for scarcity, for a world where sweetness meant a lucky find of ripe fruit or a dangerous climb toward a guarded hive, a handful of times a year at most. The craving is ancient. The abundance is not. Almost everything about how sugar affects you now, the cavities, the cravings that feel bottomless, the sense that you can never quite get enough, comes from that mismatch, not from some flaw in your willpower or some modern weakness in your character. Which brings you back to the spoon. Small, ordinary, forgettable. It isn't asking anything difficult of you. It doesn't need to climb a rope ladder or wait for a fruiting season or sail across an ocean. It just needs you to reach for it the way something in your biology has been built to do since long before there were humans to do the reaching. The sweetness dissolving in your cup right now is answering a want that predates your species by tens of millions of years. Only the ease is new. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.